1971, one American paycheck bought a house, a car, and a family of 4. The median American household earned about $9,030 that year, according to the Census Bureau, and the median new house sold for about $25,200. Call it 2 3/4 years of a single income. In 2024, the median American household earned about $83,700, more than 9 times the money. But the median new house now sells for about $420,000, which is 5 years of income. And most households are earning it with 2 people working instead of 1. 9 times the money, less of the house. Between those 2 ledgers sits one Sunday evening in August of 1971, and a decision that almost nobody in the country understood while it was happening. This is not the story of why that decision was made. That story has been told many times. This is the story of the bill it left behind, and of exactly which line on an ordinary household budget that bill lands on. Start with the rest of that 1971 page, because you cannot see a shift without the line it shifted from. A gallon of gasoline, according to the Energy Information Administration, averaged 36 cents that year. And the interest a bank was legally allowed to pay on an ordinary passbook savings account was capped by a Federal Reserve rule called Regulation Q at 4.5% at a commercial bank, 5% at a savings and loan. Consumer prices that year rose about 4%, so the household that saved carefully roughly kept pace, and no better. Write those lines on a page, and you have the shape of a normal American budget at the start of the decade. 1 earner in most cases. A house at 2 3/4 times the annual income. Savings that at least held their ground. Hold that page. We are going to redraw it twice. Now the afternoon itself briefly, because the room is not where the story lands. On Friday, the 13th of August, 1971, President Richard Nixon went to Camp David with about 15 advisors, among them Treasury Secretary John Connally and Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns. Foreign governments held far more dollars than the United States held gold to redeem them with, and the redemptions had begun. On Sunday evening, the 15th of August, at 9 o'clock, Nixon went on national television from the Oval Office and announced 3 things at once. Executive Order 11615 froze wages and prices for 90 days. Proclamation 4074 put a 10% surcharge on imports. And then came the sentence the world was actually listening for. He had directed Secretary Connally, he said, to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The word temporarily is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The suspension has now lasted more than 50 years. Here is what that meant in plain terms, and it is worth being precise, because the fog around this event is where a great deal of nonsense grows. Before that night, the dollar had a fixed definition in gold, $35 to the ounce, and every other major currency was pegged to the dollar. That arrangement, built at a New Hampshire resort in 1944, was called Bretton Woods. Ordinary Americans could not walk into a bank and trade dollars for gold. Private gold ownership had been ended by Executive Order 6102 in April of 1933, and was not restored until the last day of 1974. What existed was a promise between governments, and that promise acted as a ceiling. It meant there was an outside limit on how many dollars could ultimately exist, because at some point, somebody could ask for the metal. After the 15th of August, there was no such limit. Attempts were made to rebuild one, and the record of those attempts is kept by the Federal Reserve's own published history. The Smithsonian Agreement that December devalued the dollar to $38 an ounce. A second devaluation followed in February of 1973 to $42.22. By March, the major currencies were simply floating against one another, and the Jamaica Accords, negotiated in Kingston in January of 1976, wrote the floating world into the rules of the International Monetary Fund. Every one of those attempts failed for the same reason, and each failure showed up in the same place: the price of a week of groceries. That is the mechanism. It is not a conspiracy, and it is not a theft. It is a change in what kind of thing the unit of account was. And on its own, it is not yet the answer to which line the bill lands on. To find that, you have to watch what the ordinary numbers did afterward. Watch the money supply first, because it is the clearest fingerprint. In August of 1971, the Federal Reserve's measure of the nation's money stock, the series economists call AMP2, stood at about $685 billion. Today, that same series is over $23 trillion. Some of that is simply a larger country doing more business, and the definition of the series was revised in 2020, so the two ends are not a perfect like for like. But the direction is not in question, and neither is what it did to prices. Measured by the Consumer Price Index kept by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, $1 from 1971 buys today what about 12 cents bought then. Turn that around, because turned around is how a family experiences it. The price level in this country is now roughly 8 times what it was the year the gold window closed. In the 50 years before 1971, a stretch that included 2 world wars and the Great Depression, prices had not done anything close to that. Now redraw the page. 1981, 10 years on. Median household income, according to the Census Bureau, had risen to about $19,070, more than double the 1971 figure, which sounds like a decade of triumph until you set the other lines beside it. The median new home from the same census series now sold for about $68,900. So the house that had cost 2 3/4 years of income now cost about 3.5. The mortgage on it, according to the Freddie Mac survey that has tracked rates since 1971, carried an interest rate of 18.63% in the week of October the 9th, 1981, the highest in the entire history of that survey. And the savings account was still capped near 5.25% under Regulation Q, while consumer prices, measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics from December to December, had run above 12% in 1974 and above 13% in 1979. That is a ceiling on the reward for thrift, set by rule, sitting well below the rate at which money was losing value. A household that did everything right, spent less than it earned, and put the difference in the safest place the system offered, was guaranteed by law to lose ground. That is not a metaphor. It is the arithmetic of the ledger line. And now the third drawing of the same page, the one you are living on. Median household income in the United States, per the Census Bureau, was about $83,700 in 2024, more than 9 times the 1971 figure. The median new home sells for about $420,000, which is nearly 17 times its 1971 price. Run the ratio one last time. 2 3/4 in 1971, about 3.5 in 1981, about 5 today. That drift is the whole of it, and it is worth saying carefully, because it is easy to get wrong in either direction. Housing has its own separate causes: zoning and land and construction costs and interest rates and where people want to live, and no honest account blames all of it on one August evening. But the denominator of that ratio, the income line, is where the 50-year story lives, and it is the line almost nobody looks at, because here is the figure that reframes everything. Average hourly earnings for production and non-supervisory workers, which is to say most working Americans, adjusted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index, reached a peak in the early 1970s, and by that measure, did not durably regain it until around 2020, close to half a century. Economists genuinely argue about the right price index for that comparison, and it matters. Deflate the same wage series by the Commerce Department's measure instead, and the recovery arrives decades sooner. But on the measure the household itself feels at the register, the typical hourly wage, spent most of a working lifetime going sideways. And yet, household income in dollars kept climbing, and households kept buying homes and cars and educations. How? The ledger answers that too, and the answer is two lines that barely existed in 1971. The first is the second paycheck. Participation in the paid labor force among married women, per the Bureau of Labor Statistics Household Survey, rose from about 41% in 1970 to a peak above 60% around the end of the century. A great deal of what looks like rising household income is not a rising wage at all. It is a second person going to work. The second line is debt. Household debt, measured against disposable income from the Federal Reserve's own accounts, went from about 60% in 1971 to a peak near 135% in 2007 and sits near 90% today. A household that could no longer close its budget with one wage closed it with two, and when two were not enough, closed it with credit. A budget programmed to fail. That phrase deserves precision because it is a strong one. Nothing about the household changed, and the discipline did not go anywhere. If you have watched the other videos on this channel, you have seen those ledgers. The reused foil, the bones kept back for stock, the price book carried to 3 stores, the meat boycott of 1973, the whip inflation now buttons of 1974. And the numbers back that up. In 1975, American households saved about 13% of what they took home. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, today they save between 3 and 4%. Americans did not get lazy in 1972. What changed is that the system stopped having an outside limit on the quantity of the unit those ledgers were written in. And in a system like that, holding money becomes a slowly losing position by default, while holding things that inflation lifts becomes a slowly winning one. The household that already owned assets in 1971 rode that current. The household that was saving up to buy them was swimming against it. Nothing was stolen from anybody. The rules of the game changed direction under the feet of people who had been taught the old ones and were still playing them faithfully. There is a reason so much anger attaches to this particular date. This video is not going to tell you what to hold, what to buy, or what will protect you. There is no asset named here and no advice to give, and the urgency that builds around this date is itself a product which sells well. What the ledger supports is narrower and more useful. A description of the current. After 1971, the American household budget acquired a permanent headwind on its cash line. And the thing that used to be automatic about thrift, that saving carefully would carry you forward, stopped being automatic. This is a statement about mechanics, not morals, and every number in it is checkable in the census tables, the Bureau of Labor Statistics price series, and the Federal Reserve's own data, all of which are public and free. There is one more thing in these numbers, and it is the part left out of both the nostalgic version of this story and the angry one. The generation that lived through it was not fooled. They noticed first because they were the ones keeping the books. I would like to be able to name one of them here, and I cannot. The ledgers that survive mostly survive anonymously in attics and estate sales and boxes at auction, with no name on the cover. But take an ordinary household of 4 on the median income, keeping its books the way millions did, and what that page records month after month is a small private measurement of the currency itself. They had no word for what they were seeing, and no Federal Reserve series or ratio chart to check it against. What they had was a page with the same items on it, priced differently every quarter, and a growing suspicion that careful was no longer enough. They were right. That suspicion was the most accurate piece of economic analysis in the country at the time. And it was written in pencil at kitchen tables. Which is the point of keeping a ledger at all? It is the only instrument an ordinary household ever had that measured money from the inside. A price index is compiled in Washington from thousands of quotes and published with a lag. A ledger is compiled at a kitchen table by somebody who remembers exactly what the same bag of groceries cost in the spring. When the two disagree, the ledger is usually the one that noticed first. 1 paycheck, 2 3/4 years to a house, 2 paychecks, 5 years. Nobody announced that on television. The decision made at Camp David was announced on a Sunday evening in a 20-minute address, and most of the people watching went to bed believing very little had happened to them. The evidence that something had was not in the speech. It was on the next page of the ledger, and the page after that, and it is still accumulating. If your family kept books through those years, or if you still have one of those ledgers in a drawer, I would genuinely like to know what the first line was that looked wrong. That is where these stories get saved.